We're so quiet. I'm used to like playing music or something before our live streams. Need to jazz it up, Rob.
Do give us some suggestions, John, and we can improve the waiting time.
There you go. There you go. See, I already see some chats coming in. Somebody greeting Wade.
So we're already at 112, so we're going to get started here. And welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and other allied fields dealing with the built environment. Today we have planning for physical activity with Amy Groves, Wade Walker, and John Simmerman. The interviewer and moderator is myself, Robert Steuteville. So share your thoughts and hashtag on the park bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB feedback. And get the news on CNU 32. CNU 32, excuse me. It's going to be taking place in Cincinnati this year, coming in May. And this historic river city has rebuilt its urban core, harnessing its own diversity to overcome adversity. Learn more at cnu.org/CNU32. And today we have a great panel on planning for physical activity based on innovative planning work in Lake Wales, Florida. Amy Groves is principal and senior project director with Dover Kohl and Partners based in South Miami, Florida. She was the project director for the Lake Wales Envision Plan. And Wade Walker is senior principal engineer with Kittelson Associates, and he is a consultant for Lake Wales Envision, focusing on street design. And John Simmerman is founder of Active Towns. John is a health promotion professional with a specialization in the built environment. I'm Rob Steuteville, editor of CNU's Public Square, and today's discussion is all about how to plan for physical activity and lessons that apply to any community. We will learn this through a case study of Lake Wales, Florida, and Lake Wales Envision combines planning for mixed-use walkability and the preservation of green space in a plan inspired by the legendary Olmsted brothers who worked a century ago. First, there's going to be a presentation, followed by a brief follow-up discussion with the panelists, and then Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And now I'm going to pass this on to Amy to begin the presentation.
All right, great. Says I cannot start until, there we go. Okay, just let me get started. And so I'm going to start just with a brief overview of Lake Wales Envision. Let me all know if you can give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. There we go. Okay, so I'll start with an introduction to Lake Wales Envision. So this is a plan for the city of Lake Wales to guide growth and conservation within the city limits, as well as the surrounding utility service area. You can see here on the map, the dark areas and city limits, and then that surrounding area is over 50,000 acres. As Rob mentioned, the Olmsted brothers did the original plan for the city in the 1920s as a city in a garden with memorable parks. There's a historic downtown, and the surrounding area includes rolling citrus fields and large-scale natural areas. But today there's recent trends in the citrus industry and housing demands that have increased development pressures, leading to the need for this plan. So the plan was led by the city of Lake Wales, but there are a number of local and statewide partners that provided support throughout the planning effort, recognizing that this plan was important and the challenges here are similar to other peer communities. So we started in March of last year with a series of presentations of best practices, looking at community design, transportation, conservation and development, wanting to start the community conversation about what was going to be possible here. In April, we did a week-long charrette that including workshops where we gathered around tables, like you see here, to brainstorm. We also had an open design studio where we met with city staff and stakeholders and was open for the community to drop in. So it was through these conversations that the main ideas for the plan were established. We didn't just have in-person events. We also had a number of online events, presentations by our partners, as well as members of our team to get into details of specific interests of topics or specific topics of interest, such as mobility and conservation and the environment. So the final report for this project is a magazine format. It's easy to reproduce and distribute and review the recommendations. It's posted to the website for anyone who's interested to look at that at lakewalesenvision.com. There's also a short documentary that includes interviews with stakeholders and tells the story of the plan. It's just another great way of telling the story and communicating the vision. So the plan was approved last October, just a couple months ago, and endorsements by our project sponsors, helping to explain the vision and its benefits, I think really helped with that process. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about what's in the plan. So during the charrette workshops, we started by asking people where and how they wanted the city to grow. And so this is one of the exercises we did at that hands-on session, where each orange dot represented a set number of households, and each table had to place all of their dots somewhere on the map. So you can see on the right, examples from 4 of the tables. You start to see patterns, for example, growing in the south side of the city. In the zoom in, you can also see an example where one table or several tables actually did this, stacked their dots in downtown, wanting to see increases of density there as a way of accommodating the growth in population. So using this input and analysis, the Lake Wales Envision maps identify planned growth areas near the city core, as well as limited growth areas where intensive development is not as appropriate. And then we did illustrative maps like these that further convey the vision. So we show those growth areas as potential employment centers and new neighborhoods with their own green networks, and also potential large-scale conservation areas. So one of the aspirations that the City Commission adopted as we started this process was assembling an enduring green network of open spaces and conservation lands. There are 4 main efforts in the plan, and this green network is the first one that I'm going to describe. And so we started this by identifying priority areas, studying the existing data, where there are wetlands, the rare species habitats, critical landscape linkages, and combining these all together and seeing where they overlap. And what we saw was a network of priority size emerging in corridors to the sites, the corridors to the east and the west of the city. This became known as the Big Green Network. So looking at that another way from overhead, here are those parcels that were identified as priorities for the Big Green Network. And then we started thinking about how can these be connected to residents and folks in the city. And so you can see here a network of tree-lined streets and trails. Wade's going to talk in a few minutes a bit more about this. And then we talked about neighborhoods. So here's the neighborhood green network, and that includes the existing city parks, as well as potential new green areas that would accompany the new development and bring that green network into the city. So that would be greenways, stormwater treatment areas that could double as parks, basically thinking about how all these green connections could be made. So wondering about how this can be implemented, the report talks about a number of ways. It could include acquisition, it could include conservation easements, new land development regulations, but most importantly, conversations and collaboration and partnerships is really what would be needed to bring this to fruition. So as an example, a first step was announced earlier this month. During the charrette, we talked with the Freelanders, who are lifelong residents of Lake Wales, and they talked about wanting to put their ranch into permanent protection. The parcel is, immediately adjacent to existing conservation lands and really a great candidate for part of the Big Green Network. So that started a conversation with the city and the county, and the land is now being considered for acquisition through the county's program. So the next area of focus of the plan is economy. And, this is an idea about the plan, building prosperity and really creating the needed infrastructure for opportunity. So the illustrative plan identifies large areas that could be dedicated for employment centers. And it also describes mixed use centers in the existing downtown and along the city's commercial corridors that could incorporate jobs and industry. So here's an example of what that could look like. This is on State Highway 60, and you see here an existing shopping center with vacant out parcels, and then the vision for how that could be redeveloped as a mixed-use neighborhoods with walkable streets and quality green spaces. It's not only residential that, that area could be, the area is adjacent to a hospital. And so the site could include new jobs, medical offices, and be the foundation of a new health district. So, an example of how the area could grow to accommodate more jobs. And this quote from the president of the Chamber of Commerce, I think, is pretty telling and explaining the key idea behind the plan's economic development strategy. And it's basically that the focus is on neighborhoods and the physical environment that they create, and that's going to attract investors and industry to this area. So that leads into the next focus of the plan, and that's neighborhood design. And so here's a zoom in of the illustrative plan showing those potential growth areas as a series of walkable neighborhoods, 5-minute walk from center to edge. I know many on the line will be familiar with these principles, but the plan illustrates them, showing how the neighborhoods could contain a mix of housing units, but the design of these is really important. So buildings are oriented to front the sidewalks and create walkable tree-lined streets. We talked a lot during the plan about the importance of alleys as means of access for vehicles, but then what alleys mean for the positive pedestrian experience along the street. In neighborhood green spaces fronted by the fronts of buildings, creating a sense of shared space and a quality public realm. So we talked about this as the Lake Wales Way. It was, development of traditional neighborhoods like the historic parts of town. So the report includes a series of images like this that says like this, not like this, and it illustrates and explains that vision. And that the vision includes neighborhoods that have a mix of uses. So, daily needs and walking distance. So not every single trip has to be made by a car, but there's places to go walking and biking. And it also describes details about how buildings should front streets and public spaces to create walkable places and places that are easy to bike. So the vision applies not only to new neighborhoods, but also to those limited growth areas. So for example, we could have a conservation village where you have the development clustered and only apply to a portion of the parcel and have the rest for those large scale natural areas. So to shape those design of neighborhoods and conservation villages, we've drafted a new TND ordinance that would help to guide new development. So this is under review by the city, but includes things like standards for neighborhood design, as well as design for streets and open spaces. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Wade to talk more about the mobility aspects of the plan.
Thanks, Amy. And I think one of the important aspects of the plan is you see all of those 4 components, and they were all very, very integrated, and one relies on the other. From a mobility standpoint, once the decision was made by the community to really focus on a vision that looked at these mixed use, more dense village kinds of nodes for development, as well as infill within the downtown, it really guided the mobility system that would enable that vision to occur. So, we took some basic principles whenever we started looking at the mobility system, and really, the general principles were that we had to be sensitive to the context. We had to have the right street in the right place. We needed the streets to be safe, and not just safe for people surrounded by 6,000 pounds of steel, but also those on bikes and walking. The streets needed to be for everyone. Not only everyone, regardless of their mode of transportation or their choice of mode of transportation, but also being able to cover the 8 to 80 perspective as well. And like Amy mentioned earlier, even the street design needed to be done in the Lake Wales way. So we paid a lot of attention to the aesthetic and how it blended with both the natural and the built environments. Next. I'm sure all of you have seen this comparison before, but we took it a little step further in Lake Wales to really kind of show people. We heard a lot of, I'm choking on traffic all the time. So we used this illustration to start to show them, well, this is why you feel this way, especially on the bigger east-west and north-south major arterials. So, Lake Wales traditionally developed in a more traditional pattern, in the Lake Wales way. But what does that mean for traffic, comparing the 2 types of development patterns? Well, next, if you get to, if we start to look at that, there were a lot of ahas in the with the community that, oh yeah, I guess that is why I'm choking on traffic, because everything that I'm doing is reliant on me getting in the car and getting out on this road with everybody else that is going on different, different trip purposes, different destinations. System like that, where you have a large state arterial, and then you're point loading all of these single uses. You've got a system that's really set up for longer distance trips. DOT has absolutely no interest in providing, the small short local trip. They're looking at a bigger statewide system. Streets then are designed only for cars. And what happens in that situation is you can have a very small amount of additional development, but the impacts that it has on that facility and the amount of congestion can be huge. Whereas next, if we look at the a more traditional way of doing it, and you really can see this play out around downtown, is that in that traditional mixed use development pattern, it can handle those increases. There's a redundancy in the network. The streets are more of a people scale, friendly to all modes. And most importantly, it's a system that becomes friendly to short trips, which can be accomplished by walking or biking, and will have those destinations that people want to go to within that distance as well. Next. When we really start to look at that, it really does align with how we can create walkable places. There's very little of it. 9 and 10 are really the only two that are really governed by what we learn in school for traffic engineering. Everything else has to do with the place and the urban design and the planning. So all of those factors were taken into account whenever we started to look at the mobility system for Lake Wales. Next. Safety. I can't stress safety enough. I'm sure all of you know Florida's track record right now with pedestrian and bicycle serious injuries and fatalities. The good news is we're working really, really hard to try to reverse that. But one of the realizations is that speed kills. Absolutely. And it's not a linear relationship. As with many things in engineering, for instance, whenever you increase a travel speed by 1%, the injury crash rate increases by 2%, serious injury by 3%, and fatalities by about 4%. So those are all things that we want to. So travel speeds, higher speeds increase not only the probability, but the severity of those incidents. And whenever we're talking vulnerable users like as pedestrians and cyclists, that makes sense. So we really started off with looking at the community and what had been built and the street network that was the major street network that was in place. The city had done a mobility plan that really looked at those different connections and looked at potentially adding retrofitting complete streets. We took a harder look at that and really started to flesh that out as to what are complete streets in the Lake Wales way. So next. And so basically we looked at 3 different types of roads, 3 different types of streets within Lake Wales, one being the larger state roads. This is a State Road 60 that Amy showed the what if of earlier. And one of the things that we looked at next, one of the things we looked at is how can we, I think we may have missed one. But anyway, looking at how can we make those cross connections and humanize a street like that as well. So interesting sidebar is that Florida Department of Transportation can actually do these kinds of enhancements through regular resurfacing. We were blessed with all 3 of our major state highways in Lake Wales were slated for that resurfacing and trying to work with the department to get those these retrofits accomplished. Next. Also really, again, looking at an additional street. This is Burns Avenue. This is the street that runs right in front of Bach Tower Gardens. And it's a 5-lane facility, carries around 8,000 vehicles a day. No one really could tell us why it was widened to this cross section at some point in the future, but I think everybody agreed that it could be something better, especially where it was. Next. And so we got a lot of direction from the community. The hands-on session that Amy showed the picture of earlier, we actually did a build a street exercise in addition to the dot exercise and asked people, what would you do with Burns? And next, what we found was that people really gravitated to a rethink of Burns Avenue. And so separated bike facilities, potentially rain gardens, much more lush landscaping, and repurposing a lot of that asphalt next to provide what would be a great street that fronts this national treasure of Bok Tower Gardens, which you see the entry sign on the right side of the screen. And if we start to think about what could happen there, this is one of 3 roundabouts that would be proposed along Burns, and you can see the level of streetscape and amenities within that corridor as well. Next. So the 3rd level would be the neighborhood level streets, neighborhood level street network. And so we started with a street palette of, I believe, 2 cross sections. And we said, well, if we're going to have new streets and new neighborhoods, we need to really humanize those rural roads that we would be leading to, and start to provide some definition as to how you enter and travel through these areas. So what you see is a palette of street types that we developed. One being how it transitions from the more rural road as it comes into a settlement area. Another being a single family and a multifamily kind of facility, and then separated bike facilities as well. One of the 4 of many street sections that were developed. From a transit standpoint, looked at building on some of the existing county transit service, but also augmenting with local circulator shuttle services that could be taken in piecemeal, in small bite-sized increments. One of the first ones that the city is looking at is between downtown and Bok Tower Gardens as well. So really looking at how can we amp up transit service, since we are going to have development that's a little more concentrated. Next. Finally, we looked at the trail network, and in this part of the state, there are some planned trails that were memorialized within the mobility plan, but we also looked at some additional opportunities that were afforded to us, next slide, by the Big Green Network and the new neighborhoods that were developed. You saw this earlier with the arrows showing those connections, and we tried to find some opportunities to actually put some meat on these bones and really look at some additional trail networks. So looking at some water corridors, utility corridors, being able to get people through the new development and the new villages, and getting them to and from downtown as well. And this is just an example of an image for a trailside, a creekside trail, such as what might happen along the Peace Creek in the western part of the city. With that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wade. So really, when we look at an overview such as this, and we see the mobility network, in my mind, it really helps us understand one of the key challenges that we have as humans. We are naturally gravitate towards physical activity. Walking was our original mobility mode of getting around. And so it's helpful to understand a little bit of, the human nature and the psychology behind how we choose to get around and how we choose to interact with our communities. So keeping in mind that physical activity is a natural part of daily life for humans. However, so is being sedentary, and so is being lazy and taking the easy way. And so one of the big challenges that we have now in our current realm is that so much of our environment is designed around using the automobile and taking, quote unquote, the easy way. And so part of what we're trying to do in communities such as this is making that active choice an easy choice. And we can do that through strategies where these little nudges, and a lot of it has to do with proximity. So when we look at an overview like this, and the way that I look at a community is through the eyes of activity assets. What will actually encourage people to choose to do an active thing? What's the proximity to a park? What's the proximity to a pool, a pathway, protected bike lanes in the community? These are all critical things. And so proximity is a very big aspect to that, but then also ensuring that, it's truly a pleasant environment. And we're going to kind of look at that a little bit in just a little bit. But the other thing that's out there is when we look at an overview like this, we see the network design and we can see the colors basically referencing different types of streets. But there's also, at a finer grain level, if we were to zoom in, we also see that there's an hidden activity asset, an active mobility network in there as well. And it's what Wade was mentioning earlier is, at the more discrete community level and the neighborhood level that Amy was talking about, is how comfortable is it to be able to just walk out your door and be able to get to meaningful destinations, and being able to create more meaningful destinations within walking and biking distance. And so what I would like to do is take a relook at the street palette. So next, Amy. So when we look at this, we're seeing, as Wade had mentioned, the different sort of strategies of, different types of streets. And we're seeing some active mobility ingrained in that. And for those in the audience that might be, really adamant active mobility advocates, that they see the sharrows and they're like, that makes them very, very uncomfortable very, very fast. And I want to show a quick little video here, and we'll keep our fingers crossed with the technology gods that this will work, and show you and bring some of these active mobility street types to life here. This particular video, it's a little jarring here. Hopefully it'll smooth out over time, but this is actually shot in Delft in the Netherlands last November. And the reason why I wanted to show this is because the environment here is of similar density and scale and human scale nature. And what we're seeing out here on the streets is, people going about their daily life. And you'll notice that there really is truly a mixing of mobility modes in this particular environment. And I do apologize if this is a little difficult to watch. It in my screen, it looks like it's a little jumpy. I'll be sure to provide the link to the original film that you can take a look at. I published it last week, and you can see it in all its glory. But really, what I wanted to focus on here is just the diversity of people that you're seeing out here. Wade mentioned it earlier, is that we're designing these streets to be truly welcoming to all ages and abilities. And you'll see in this particular segment here where, parents are sort of riding with some of their kids, but then you see an entire cluster of basically middle schoolers and high schoolers heading on into school on this early morning in November. And it's also very, very important to embrace and understand that these are open streets. This is not some sort of controlled environment. Amy and I were talking about this before we hit the play button here, is that, really, this is just like any morning. I mean, this was literally November 14th, 2022. Was my last morning, and I went out with my iPhone to shoot this. So the point really is that we're creating an environment where truly all ages and abilities can feel like they can venture out into their communities. And again, this is one of the things that we're hoping to achieve with the Lake Wales plan and many other developments around North America and elsewhere. We're looking to try to get the densities right and the street design right so that it reinforces the type of behavior that we'd like to see. Obviously, from my perspective, I'd love to see more people participating in active mobility. But in order for that to really truly happen, we need to make sure that the environment is truly safe and inviting, for those people who are out there. And you'll notice too that, drivers are here. It's not a completely car-free network. And in fact, it reinforces them being able to participate in life, everybody participate in life, and share the space. One of the things that I really want to emphasize on as well, too, is the scale of the buildings that we're looking at here. We're not looking at massive buildings here. We're looking at a similar type of scale to what we saw in the illustrations there in the Lake Wales area, and really. Truly, I mean, somebody just commented, and drivers are expected to be civil, yes. And in fact, it's reinforced by the design of the streets as well as the off-street network. And we just saw a person on a mobility scooter go by, again, enforcing or reinforcing the concept that we want this to truly be an all ages and all abilities environment. And the final slide, Amy. And again, or not final slide, the second to the final slide. Again, I wanted to show this overview because it does reinforce exactly what we saw on the video, is that we're seeing in a more North American context, in a Florida context, the same type of situation that we're looking at in terms of the level of density, the narrower streets, and trying to create a human scale environment, which encourages people to get out there, get active, get along. And if you do have to drive, you can still drive, but you're encouraged to do so at a more civil pace. The final slide here. And again, having activity assets within easy reach. We see access to parks, access to green spaces, trails, and greenways. It really super important, because we know from a health behavior perspective and from a public health perspective, including mental health, access to greenery and having greener streets is a huge part of it. And that's one of the things that you'll really notice about the way that this plan was brought together. And a lot of the streets that Wade had talked about, there was an incorporation of a lot of street trees in this design. And that's all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you all for the presentations. And once again, I wanted to remind everybody to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions. There were a number of questions that have been asked in the chat. Please, if you could, just copy and paste those into the Q&A function of Zoom. We already have a couple of questions, but first, I'm going to ask a few questions. And one thing that strikes me is that active living is embedded at the core of the Lake Wales Envision plan. This is clearly, not an afterthought, not a byproduct. There's a lot of new urbanist plans out there that, active living is part of it, but it's really, it's sort of an outcome of the planning. Can you talk about the distinction between putting health and physical activity at the core of the planning versus maybe a secondary effect?
I'll get started, and then Wade and John, please jump in. But I think that this is just a really great opportunity where Lake Wales, the situation that Lake Wales is in, and that they are seeing, kind of their planning ahead of time for, this amount of growth that they're seeing coming their way. And so being able to, visualize and get their regulations in place for that type of development, I think is just really key. And so, you can, sit with the community and kind of talk about what brings quality of life and what's important to you. And, for existing residents, how could new neighborhoods make things better? And, for even, thinking about folks who are going to live in those neighborhoods, how could they be better? And so I think from that standpoint, the active living component just, kind of comes straight out as, just being key to quality of life. And having access to parks, and as John was mentioning, for not just for physical health but mental health, and it's just a key thing. So I think this is an exciting project for me to work on personally, because again, it's kind of at that stage where we could really make a difference and kind of see something really exciting happening for Lake Wales.
Yeah, Amy, I think another really important part to point out is I believe a lot of the idea of activity and active living is baked in all the way back to the Olmsted Brothers' original plan for the city. One of the things that really struck me as very unique about Lake Wales is the waterfront, the waterfront around Lake Wales, spelled with an I-L-E-S, but the center lake that showed on the diagram, whenever that was originally planned, you think about Florida and lakefront property or beachfront property, and it's all privatized. And that's where the big houses go, and you know, heretofore none shall pass. In Lake Wales, you know, that whole waterfront around the lake was envisioned as public waterfront. And a lot of people, you go out there any time of day and there's people walking on the pathway around Lake Wales. And you know, the plan that Amy's group worked on preceding this for downtown actually looked at, you know, making connections from the lake into downtown, and they've done separated bike lanes with some lane reallocations on roadways. And then you also see the trail system. So I think a lot of that activity is built in, and a lot of the desire is built in, and it truly is. And you know, it truly is a case of if you build it, they will come and they will use it. So, you know, we're really seeing that play out in Lake Wales.
And I'll speak just quickly to, you know, sort of the difference between the activity assets that we build that are in the built environment. And Wade just said, you know, if we build it, and they will come. And then I usually include a ... If we've built the right thing in the right way, and we follow that up with encouragement, engagement, and education and awareness activities, and we have the policies in place that, you know, really help manifest and bring the right thing into fruition in the first place. And so oftentimes, you know, folks are like, oh, well, you know, hey, we built a bike lane, but why isn't anybody using it? Well, oftentimes it's probably not the right bike lane. It's probably not in the right place, in the right environment. And it may not be comfortable to all ages and abilities. And more importantly, going back to that network, was it part of an entire comprehensive network that gets people to meaningful destinations and is truly, to Wade's point, an all ages and abilities facility, a network of facilities that get you there? And so the other thing that I wanted to point out, and looking back to that little video and, you know, seeing the parents sort of working with them, that's part of the activity assets. That's the software activity assets. It's the engagement, it's the encouragement, it's the awareness, and you know, the stuff that takes place, the soft stuff that takes place, that really truly brings life to our built environments, to our bike lanes, to our safer streets that are out there. But then that extends to what a city can do. So from a planning perspective, you can also be looking at, okay, we're going to build this out. Hopefully it'll, you know, get built out very quickly in terms of being able to have a comprehensive network, but then also overlaying that with those other softer side of things like the engagement and the awareness. And then I saw a question, you know, pop up in here about maintenance and management of the facilities, because for them to be truly welcoming and inviting all ages and abilities facilities, we need to make sure that they're well maintained and they're desirable and pleasurable places to be and occupy. So it sort of layers in it that way. Again, my brain is thinking of it in terms of activity assets that are the hardware and the software.
Great. We've talked a lot about street design, but there was also, you know, in some of the planning images, there was discussion of trails, or clearly trails were shown. It strikes me that trails, multi-use trails, are becoming even more important these days with all of the advances in micro mobility and e-bikes and so forth, that you can really get around without a car a lot easier, especially with, you know, if you have an e-bike. And can you talk a little bit about how trails fit into the Lake Wales plan, and how this could apply to other communities as well?
Wade, do you want to start that one?
Yeah, I can. And Rob, I mean, we looked at it as an integral part of the plan, really looking at multimodal accessibility, biking, walking, and taking some lessons from downtown and some of the things that we've seen in the neighborhoods around downtown, and then starting to apply those to the context of, a new small village or hamlet in what was a citrus grove at one point that would still be proximate to town, but it would have its own its own mix of uses and attractions and destinations and goods and services, as well as residential. And we knew that we really needed to make sure all of those were connected. So, but we wanted to make sure they were connected in a thoughtful way, and one that really blended with the plan. And because we started to look at, with what Amy was talking about with the big green network, and looking at ways to connect those, but also being able to connect the dots on these settlement areas as well. And what we found was there were not only water corridors that we could utilize for that, but also utility corridors. So, if there is any kind of blessing of overhead power lines, it's that, a lot of the right of way can be used for, trail corridors, and a lot of the utility companies actually encourage that and have guidelines about how you can do that. So, we really looked at how can we make those connections. Let's connect these settlement areas, but let's also connect these huge green assets that we have in the community as well. Rob, you brought up a good point, and it's one thing that the rise of e-bikes and the increase in trail usage that we saw as a result of during the pandemic, and quite frankly has continued into present day, is as we are getting these other technologies, we're now dealing with some of the things on trails that we've been dealing with on roadways, and that behavior of some users with regard to speed doesn't necessarily mesh with others. So we really are trying to bake in a good amount of design now to really manage speeds and speed differentials on trails. But we're also looking at applying speed management and traffic calming techniques in a trail vernacular as well. So things like terminating vistas and deflections within a trail context, other than just on roadways now. So the fact that we're now having to calm trails tells me that more people are using them.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm observing and watching and documenting globally is, this challenge of, as the pathways get more and more crowded, and we do see those speed differentials that Wade just mentioned, we need to take that safety situation into concern and into consideration. What we are also seeing too is that many communities are realizing they underbuilt their system. They underbuilt the pathways and the trails. And so they're realizing now they need to go in and make them much wider because they are being, quote unquote, loved to death. Part of the big challenge, and Wade, you touched upon this as well, is making sure that we create systems and management programs to be able to, sort of work on what expectations are. We saw certain behaviors out there on the streets of Delft there where, everybody was kind of getting along and the drivers were being very, very patient. We're going to see that sort of expectation management out on the trails. I also tend to think of these active mobility networks as being all inclusive. And I try to really gauge and guide communities not to make their trails and pathways be just serving one purpose, not just being a recreational trail. I mean, there's an opportunity to make almost any trail, any pathway, something where you can connect people to meaningful destinations and not just be like a one-way trail to a dead end, and it only is considered a recreation asset. So that's one of the things that I try to encourage people to take into consideration.
Got a lot of questions, and we're going to get to these in a minute. I wanted to ask one more, and you guys talked a lot about the Lake Wales Way, and I'm wondering whether, this is substantially different from the way in some other city, and how would you apply this concept to another city? Is there a Syracuse way? I'm in Syracuse. Is there a Fayetteville way? And how would it differ from the Lake Wales way?
Well, I think, the Lake Wales way is really looking at, how the historic parts of town that everyone loves and treasures, and thinking about how that can apply to new development. So I think that absolutely applies in many communities, and, it's what urbanists are doing, right? So, looking at the Lake Wales way could also be, thought of as, traditional neighborhood development, but just looking at, the things that we love and what the DNA of the town is, and, what those streets look like, how the houses front the streets, with front porches and, close to the sidewalks, and, looking at the setbacks and how that all looks and feels, and then, designing our new neighborhoods to fit that way.
So we're going to get to some questions. And once again, if you have questions, you can ask them in the Q&A function of Zoom. And we had one from Scott. What are the kind of state and local policy changes you each recommend to make this sort of shift easier and more possible? I want to turn this. I mean, you can answer that question just as he asked it, but there was a slide shown in there about the Florida context zones. And it really wasn't talked about much, but I think this is so important, what Florida has done with its context zones. And I wanted to ask how that policy change in Florida is affecting the Lake Wales Envision plan, or how it could affect other plans.
Wait, I think that's the FDOT context zones. Is that the one
That's
that you're
right,
referring
yes.
to?
Yes.
Maybe Wade, you could start.
Yeah. Sorry, Rob, I'm dealing with a small computer issue.
I'll jump in, Wade, and you can add to it. I'll do my best to think of how Wade Walker would answer the question. But I think we're excited that FDOT has taken the lead at looking at context and designing streets to fit the context that you're in. So they have a whole series of zones, and they think about that the design of a suburban road is much different than the design of a road in town, and you need to be thinking about the lane widths and the sidewalks and all of those aspects differently depending on where you are. So it's great that FDOT has taken that leadership in defining those things. It used to be that we were having to make to start from scratch, but now we can actually pull out the FDOT manual and show those design standards, and start from those, and all be talking the same language. So I think it's absolutely just a great thing that FDOT has done.
Just for a little bit of context here, Florida is the first and only state that has where the DOT, the state DOT, has taken the transect concept and has applied that to road design through its context zones. And so that if you have a if you have a place that is either a walkable city or designated as planned to be a walkable place, you would design that differently from if you were planning a thoroughfare through a rural highway context. And so this gives the street designers, i.e. the engineers, a way to think about street design in a different way. And so that is one policy change, obviously, but that was a broader question if anybody wanted to jump in before I move on. But for other policy ideas that could apply to making it easier for active transportation. Maybe John?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, since it is phrased as a broader type of question, you get into everything from land use patterns and what you can do in terms of state and local policies that make it easier to be able to build places where meaningful destinations are within proximity to other, to residences and being able to, get to places, as well as policies that make it feasible and possible, speaking of transportation and mobility, to be able to create streets that are truly designed around people and not just around a level of service and trying to move as many cars as possible through a space. So.
Yeah, and apologies, my computer decided to go haywire for a second. But Rob, I mean, I think one of the really important pieces to understand about the context classification system is, it is something that our Department of Transportation, in response to the safety crisis that we've had, is really taking a lot of steps to really focus on safety, and especially safety for vulnerable users such as pedestrians and cyclists, even to the point that we are, as part of just general resurfacings, uh, they can include that, they now regularly include pedestrian and bicycle safety projects in general resurfacing projects. So it's been an uphill climb, but just really understanding that we all have practiced it for years, but even on a state level, an understanding that the context is different and we should really be designing for the context is huge.
Revolutionary. And we have a question about the intentions going into Shape the Lake Wales code. Could we talk a little bit about the code reform issues in Lake Wales and how that's helping to create an active place?
So, I mean, probably the most important code reform is the T&D ordinance that I mentioned. So, I mean, this is, specifically to shape the design of new neighborhoods, and it lays out the, standards for neighborhood design. It includes street design standards in there. So, requirements for those tree-lined streets and sidewalks and things to be included. And so that I think is probably the most important aspect. But then also, through this project, we went through the existing code and just, made sure there weren't any barriers, seeing how we could, what would need to be changed to make sure there wasn't anything preventing the development this way. But I think, having a T&D ordinance that, specifically proactively calls out all the design things that we're talking about, and incentivizing that and getting folks to use that ordinance is important.
There was a question about the communication engagement. I know that Amy, you talked about had quite a few slides on engagement, public engagement, but in speaking broadly, in terms of planning for physical activity, what are the keys to getting people to really get behind that concept?
Well, I mean, I think, I tried to highlight that we had, a number of different ways to reaching out to folks, not just having in-person meetings, but a number of online, opportunities as well. So, during the Charrette Week, having, not just the big meetings, but the open studio, people could drop in. I think I saw a question asking about kids, and we did, try to incorporate kids into the planning process. We had a kids table at the hands-on session, and they had the most entertaining presentation probably. So that was great. But really, this plan is for them. So I mean, that's great. That they're, and I think they said some funny things, but also some very insightful things, things that we could actually learn from and take away and incorporate into the plan. So I think we tried to make the process as open and inclusive as we can, and again, having meetings in different locations and different times of the day, having the online opportunities as well, just to get a broad amount of the community involved. And then I mentioned the idea of having the report not to be a 500-page report, but it's a short magazine that can be easily printed and distributed and kind of get the information out about what this plan is all about to people. Having the video as another resource that is another way for folks to engage with the plan and get involved, because it's not just about the plan, but now implementation. Getting people involved and informed and behind the implementation steps is it's going to be an ongoing it's an ongoing thing. It's definitely not finished. So.
Despite the sort of technical difficulties on that video, I think that really struck a chord with a lot of the audience. It was a remarkable video, and somebody points out that the visual difference between Delft and the vision for Lake Wales is the setbacks of the buildings, and the continuous building frontage that you see in Delft. You're probably not going to be seeing that in many contexts in the United States. So could you get that kind of an active environment where bicyclists and people in cars could relate to each other in the same way in an American context?
Yes. If you want a one-word answer, yes. Yeah, I mean, when you look at that density that you saw there, I mean, I can think of a couple of communities that are being built right here in Austin, Texas, that have some of those continuous fronts. And so every community is going to have its own sort of look to it and feel to it, and the lake, or the Lake Wales way that we're looking at, I still think is incredibly walkable and bikeable. And then it's just a matter of fine-tuning what that environment feels like, especially if it's going to be shared, some form of shared space on the street network. So on those streets where we're going to have a mixing of people walking and biking and in cars, then you need to make sure that we've done some of the strategies and some of the fine details of traffic calming and bringing the motor vehicle speeds down, which is exactly what Wade had talked about in terms of addressing speed.
I think too, just to add to that, Lake Wales does have a downtown area that does have that continuous building frontage like you would see in that video. It's just that's obviously not the entire city. A lot of the city is more, neighborhood areas where the buildings get detached, but they're still, as images show, the idea is that they'd be oriented towards the street, where you have, front porches, kind of still thinking of the street as public space. Not just, if you turn your back on the street or have parking lots along the street, that's when you start to see that public realm, break down, and you wouldn't have as much of the walkability and bikeability. So that's, I think, but I did want to mention that there is a part of Lake Wales that looks like that video.
Yeah, Amy, I was thinking the same thing. Is that you could walk along Park and see something that would be very similar to that scale. Certainly, I mean, not as large, but at least the scale was there. One thing that I do want to point out is that to me, and one of the things that I found is, as important as the built form is, a lot of it is simply the culture and the expectation that walking and biking are normal activities, and that sharing a street is a very normal thing to do. One of the things I mentioned, this idea of the trail traffic calming, and as part of the work that I was doing on that, we benchmarked some aspirational communities, and one of those was Boulder, Colorado. And Boulder, basically, they don't have to enforce rules on the trails or speed, because there's a lot of peer enforcement that goes on. They have a saying that they call their trail rules the way of the path. And if a user is seeing someone that is misbehaving, they'll say, "Hey, remember the way of the path. Stop doing that, or slow down." Or and so I think in a lot of communities, as those activities increase, they become normal, and there's an expectation of motorists that that activity is going to be there, and it builds on itself and does make the whole system safer.
It's interesting. You mentioned culture and norms, and there was a question that has there been any consideration around communicating etiquette? I was assuming that these trails are not just for cyclists; they must be shared with pedestrians, wheelchair users, e-bikes, etc. There is a different etiquette when you're talking about designing for all users, right? And it's something that takes time to take hold.
Yeah, when you're talking about creating a culture of safe environments and a culture of activity in general, and Wade, you address this quite beautifully there, is that one, we need to make sure that it's an environment that draws people out and into that environment and encourages them to use it. And then at the same time, reinforces what the proper behavior is. When it comes around to, considerations of communicating etiquette, having lived in Boulder for a decade, Wade, in the past, I've spent many days on those trails. And yes, it is self-reinforcing. And also, having spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, those streets are also self-reinforcing in terms of in terms of what the proper etiquette and behaviors are expected out there. So it's really important too to understand that part of creating a culture of activity is, having that environment that is really truly conducive to encouraging people to do it on a regular basis. And the more regular that you do it, and it becomes something that was a pleasurable activity, you didn't feel threatened out there, it was beautiful and welcoming and pleasurable, you are able to get habit formation in the brain that reinforces that, hey, this is something that is very, very pleasurable and is beneficial. That's when you get the psychology side of things happening, and it reinforces. And that's when the power of numbers start to help out, because then you have more people doing it. You're starting to get social interaction with other people. And sometimes they're just micro interactions. Maybe it's just seeing, oh, there's Rob again on his bike. He's, hey, Rob, maybe it's just an acknowledgement that you are having these little interactions, and it brings a level of sociability up within the community. And that is a self-reinforcing thing in terms of culture.
We are now at the 1 o'clock, just after the 1 o'clock mark. And so I want to let people know that we will be posting this video. If you have to go and we ask you a question after later, that you'll be able to see the video posted on the CNU website and the answer to your question. But we're going to talk for a little bit while longer because we still have more questions to answer. Here's kind of a fun point that was made, but I think it always goes to another question that I'm always curious about. And Wade is one of the leading transportation engineers who's involved in designing walkable streets, and has been for a while. But he says Wade is a great name for a mobility expert. And, did your last name influence your path in your career, Wade? Or is that just a coincidence?
Rob, I would love to say that it did, but it's strictly a coincidence. But I'm glad that my last name isn't Driver.
Right. Okay. But how did you get into, like being one of, the few and the proud new urbanist transportation engineers?
Interesting story. I completely fell into it by accident. I always say I'm trained as an engineer, but exposure to some of the best and brightest minds in transportation and urban design have really shaped my outlook. I would say that I'm fortunate to work with people like Amy and Victor and people like that throughout my career. But probably the biggest influence was my first supervisor down in Orlando. I had the benefit of being able to work with a gentleman by the name of Walter Kulash. Those of you that are old-time CNUers probably remember Walter. And I worked directly with him for 15 years at the very early stages of my career. And being able to really look at transportation as a means of moving people and not just cars has really shaped the outlook that I have.
Well, that was really learning from the feet of the guru.
I refer to him as my sensei.
Okay. And just in fairness, I should just 30 seconds. John and Amy, how did you get into where you are right now, involved in the new urbanism?
Well, I was lucky enough, right out of school, I got a job at Dover Kohl and Partners and working for Joe and Victor, and just, have been here ever since. So that's my short story.
Yeah.
And my story is a little bit more complex. I've been working in public health and health in the built environment for about 34 years now. And I really discovered the connection between what I was doing in public health with urbanism, new urbanism, about 15, 20 years ago, I guess. And then really got engaged with CNU and realizing that how we transform and how we build our environments can really have a profound impact on the health and well-being of entire societies. And so really went down the rabbit hole of new urbanism and drinking from the fire hose of all the familiar faces. I did see a question out there from Alec Thomas about would you be measuring and monitoring health outcomes? And I'll speak to that just in general from a more global perspective. Rarely do we see health outcomes managed or monitored at a societal community level, mainly because it's really, really difficult to do so. I had a couple of environments where I was able to do some actual studies where we could atomize things and autonomize things down to actual individuals, and then maintaining, privacy, obviously, and be able to see participants versus non-participants and be able to get a return on investment of types of activities. It's way too difficult to do that. But what you do end up seeing and what we can demonstrate from a public health perspective and looking at actuarial data is that cities that do have a culture of activity and a higher percentage of people participating in active mobility, we do see that they have better health outcomes overall. So I doubt that there will be any, really fine-tuned health monitoring. Amy, you can correct me if there's a particular health group there that is looking at trying to do some before and after data, but more likely that's not typically what we see in communities.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not aware of anything, but I'll check into it and see. But it would be interesting to see.
We had a question: are there specific design codes for each street in the Lake Wales plan? I know we saw street sections that were drawn up, and probably trail sections as well. But did you get down to the point of saying this street section should go to this particular street, or maybe these two street sections should be applied to this street or that street? Did you do it in that? Did you get to that level of specificity?
I'll start, Wade, and you can add to this. I think, there are some specific recommendations for specific streets, like Burns Avenue, the one that Wade showed, that we really looked at in detail. But then beyond that, we, in the T&D ordinance, we have standards based on the context where you are. So, the neighborhood center, the middle of the neighborhood or the edge of the neighborhood, and, standards for the width of travel lanes and the width of sidewalks and planting areas and that sort of thing. So you could kind of take those components and assemble your own section that doesn't require a specific street, for example, be designed the same way in every neighborhood.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that definitely hits home on it. We did look at several specific streets in addition to Burns. We did a little bit of a deeper dive on the state roads, just knowing that they were coming up for resurfacing, and the city would have an opportunity to potentially be able to include some of the modifications within the resurfacing, and then really looked at, I think Amy hit it right that we kind of shied away from, setting street types and coding every street in the city, but more looking at, these are the guidelines of how you should do that. Part of the issue in Lake Wales was the fact that that they were using in the areas we were studying the county street design guidelines prevailed, and they have a whopping total of two street types for those kinds of areas. So we did need to add some more specificity and guidance. But my hope would be that at some point the city develops their own street design manual or set of guidelines. But to Amy's point, make sure there's enough flexibility in it to be able to deal with different issues or different contexts or different constraints that you may have.
Buddy Milliken asks, is there any provision for transfer of development rights? This would seem like a natural thing if you're really trying to create that big green network.
So that's listed among the tools to to pursue in the Big Green Network. We don't have a that's not fleshed out yet, but definitely one of the ways that can be done. So it's not yet in place, but certainly on the list.
And David asked for like what environmental problems were specific did you solve for? He also asked about sinkholes. I don't know if the sinkholes are an issue in Lake Wales.
Well, I think the identification of the Big Green Network is probably one of the biggest environmental aspects. Kind of identifying those priority sites for conservation where there's wetlands, where there's just critical lands, and identifying them as being prioritized for conservation, and kind of keeping that green area. So I think that's probably one of the biggest components of the plan that helps to speak to the environmental aspects.
Mm. Linda asks, as our community of Madison, Wisconsin continues to densify, people are increasingly concerned about tree canopy loss. Your drawings show terrific tree cover. Is there a tree canopy overlay envisioned that would help encourage or require private landowners to plant and maintain native trees that support a healthy ecology and provide shade?
So I think the
question.
Olmsted history in here, there is a great culture of street trees and programs for that are already existing in the city. They wanting to plant more trees, having a public program that does that. And so and with the design of new neighborhoods, they would be required to have street trees as well. So I think absolutely, from the Olmsted City in a Garden history here specifically, the idea of street trees is a big part of Lake Wales. I'm glad that came through in the drawings.
Let's see. So what's the next step here? And can you talk about, I always try to broaden it to other communities, but what's the next step in Lake Wales, but what could be the next step in a similar community in creating this?
So, I mean, there's a number of next steps. There's at the back of the report, there's an implementation, steps that, kind of lay out what those are. And immediate next steps, we're planning for a meeting of the partners and co-sponsors so we could, kind of talk with, I mentioned there's all these, local organizations, Main Street, the Chamber of Commerce, all these partners who are going to help with implementation, as well as, statewide, partners, 1,000 Friends of Florida and such. So we're going to be organizing a meeting of all the partners and kind of talk about how those, they could be partners in those next steps. But, basically, the city is kind of organizing and already pursuing next steps. The T&D ordinance I mentioned is a big thing. And so we're reviewing that and getting that ready. And I mentioned there's the Freelander parcel, having that come forward as being part of the the first piece of the Big Green Network to be permanently preserved. That's a big step. So I mean, I think a number of ways. I think Wade, you could speak to those FDOT projects, or what some of the next steps with the streets are. But I think there's a number, is not just one thing, but each of these kind of moving forward. And the city has a great way. We that we did a plan for them for downtown a few years ago, and they actually have the implementation matrix up on the website, and they have a status on each one. And I imagine they're going to do a similar thing for Lake Wales Envisioned, where they're kind of showing how progress is being made and moving forward on each of these aspects.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It sounds like implementation is the Lake Wales way.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Well, I wanted to thank the panel and everybody who attended today. It's really a great discussion. Thank you, Amy, Wade, John, and all the attendees. And once again, I appreciate everybody coming on the park bench, and we look forward to the next one in the future. And everybody have a great holiday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.